Okay, good morning. So the discussion on mitzvah shebedibur, commands of verbalization that are to be done in the original Lashon HaKodesh, at least in the Mishnah's view, the sage's view, as we discussed yesterday, the prototype message delivered in the original Lashon HaKodesh is the blessings and curses delivered by the Leviim at the mountain of Gerizim and Avel. And the Mishnah gave a little bit of a description there and described how once the Jewish people crossed the Jordan, they split 6 tribes on one mountain, 6 tribes on the other. In the middle, the ark. Circling the ark, the Leviim, Moshe Rabbeinu delivers the message, and the Levites pronounce it to the rest of the people facing one direction or the other, whether it's blessing or depending on whether it's blessing or curse. That's essentially what the Mishnah described. The Gemara now gets to analyzing the text of the verse that describes the location of the blessings and the curse and tries to deduce where that might have been. That's the exercise for today. So before we get to the actual Gemara, let's look at the pasuk in its entirety and see the context so we can understand what's going on. So if you're watching my screen, which no one here is, but future viewers, because the Torah gives a certain description as to where these mountains are. So we're going to try to figure out from that verse where this actually is. So listen to the description of what the Torah says. I'm going to try to translate it directly as possible, because as I noticed when I looked at different translations, they all pick one or the other from the Gemara. So I'm going to try to translate them as literal as possible so that we can see within those literal words 2 different ways of understanding the same text. So this is in Devarim chapter 11. It's right after the Vayam Shemaya, the second paragraph of Shema is right there. And the second paragraph of Shema is like a prelude to the blessings and curses, because it says if you will listen, you'll get the blessing. If you don't, there won't be. It's not as elaborate as the blessings and curses that are going to follow, but it's there. And right after that, the text goes on to say, the Vayam Shemaya paragraph ends with verse 21, so that you'll have length of days for you and your children in the land that God has promised your forefathers to give to them, like the days on the heavens and the earth, meaning for eternity. That's the end of Shema, Man Yirbu. That's the last line that we have. Man Yirbu Yemechem V'nechem Al Adama Asher Nishpa V'sefna. The next verse goes on to say, if you are to keep my mitzvah that I command you today, to love God, to go in his ways, to connect him, then you will go into the land. No one's going to be afraid of you. And wherever you go, you'll be successful. No one's going to stand up to you because the fear of God, your Lord, will be upon you. And then verse 26 goes on to say, see, I place before you the blessings and the curses. The blessing which you'll get for the mitzvah, and the curse if you don't listen to the mitzvah. And then verse 29 reads, it will be when you come to the land that God promised you, that you're going to inherit. And when you get there, says God, you will give the blessing on the mountain of Gerizim, and the curse in the mountain of Avel. That's verse 29. And when you get to that land, this location, so God's talking to them already on this side of the Jordan, the desert, and then, which is the eastern side of the desert, of the Jordan, the eastern side. And God says, when you get to that land, you'll go to these 2 mountains, and you'll place the blessing on the mount of Gerizim and the curse on the mount of Avel. And the next verse 30 is God telling the people where to find those mountains. And this is the words the Torah says. I'm going to read the Hebrew and try to be as direct as possible, even though what I'm going to say is cryptic. I'm doing that on purpose because the Gemara is going to extrapolate from that cryptic text where these mountains are. So I'm intentionally leaving the cryptic so that you can see how they're extrapolating, which is as directly as literal as possible. Halahema, are they not, these mountains? Be'ever Yarden, past the Jordan or over the Jordan. Be'ever literally means over. Are they not over the Jordan? Acharei derech mevoy hashemesh, literally after the way of the coming of the sun. So 2 descriptions of the way these mountains are: over the Jordan and after the way of the coming of the sun. whatever that means.
After the way.
After the way, Acharei derech, after the path.
Yeah.
Acharei derech, after the way, Mavoy Hashemesh, of the coming of the sun. Description number 2 is the way the mountain is. So we're going to see if that's sunrise or sunset. Well, we'll see. So that's number 2. Description number 1 is that's over the Jordan. Description 2 is after the way or after the path of the coming of the sun. Description 3, in the land of the Kanani, Beretz Kanani, in the land of the Kanani. Description 4, Hayoshib Arava, which are settled in the Araba. Now the Araba means the plains, which means it's flatlands, presumably. Or Araba is a location, the name of a place. Mulha Gilgal, opposite the Gilgal, another description. And then finally, Eitzel Elone Merda, near the plains of Morah. 2 words for plains, Araba or Elon. So this is the description as to where you'll find these 2 mountains, Gerizim and Avel. Now,
So you have to sort of put them all together.
that's right. Decipher these different descriptions and see if we can find out where that is. Now, I would assume that the people who were there knew what these mountains were. I'm saying that because the verse opens up with, Halohema, are they not? Are they not on the other side of the Jordan, after the way of the coming of the sun, in the land of the Kanani? But it opens up with Halohema, are they not? Almost sounds like the listeners, you guys know where it is it not in this and this and this location? And the listeners like, yeah, that's where we know that. So presumably, like they had enough information to go on, the people there. But it's
just adding confirmation of what they already know.
Confirmation, perhaps, of what they already know, but also for future generations to be able to decipher. We don't have the knowledge of those there. So us, in the times of the Mishnah, say, or the Gemara, what is it? 2,000 years after? No, not 2,000. 1,500 years after this actual event, we don't have that kind of knowledge that they had. So we have to deduce from the description where that might be. And that's the Gemara's exercise today.
How would they know where it was?
The people then?
They're going to Israel for the first time.
Good question. Perhaps they knew from the maps of the day. Perhaps they knew because there was trade, even to the Jews in the desert. People would travel to, you're talking about 2 million people in the desert, right? So there's all kinds of trade coming in and out of, and they were wealthy. They came from Egypt with lots of wealth. The Gemara discusses in Yuma, we once learned this, about the trade that would go on in the desert. So maybe they knew from that. I'm saying that it wasn't like foreign territory to them. This is the region they live in. And it's not that, the world's not that big at the time. The whole world is from Israel to Babylonia. But Babylonia is actually in those days very far. Later it became closer, but in those days, what is it? Egypt, Israel, Syria, Turkey. Turkey's probably very far at that point. Like where Avram is, where they found the first civilization, where archaeologists found the first civilization, Mesopotamia, right? How far is that already? Mesopotamia? No, Mesopotamia is isn't it Iran, Iraq, or even more south, Arabia, that region. Yeah. So presumably it was familiar to them, which is why the verse says, is it not? Halohima, is it not in this and this and this location? But we need to figure out what that is. And unfortunately, no GPS coordinates. So we got to go with the words in the text. So now let's see the Gemara. Tanu Rabbanan, our sages taught. The line begins with the word chulu, like chaf vav, and then there's a colon, and then Tanu Rabbanan. Our sages taught 33b. 33b. So the Gemara in between the 2 colons quotes the necessary text from the Mishnah, which describes the blessings and curses. Now the Gemara's analysis. And the Gemara's analysis, as is often the case, begins by introducing a Mishnaic age text that didn't make it to the final cut in the Mishnah. More elaborate than the Mishnah itself. So let's look at this. Tanu Rabbanan, our sages taught. The verse reads, Halohema, are those mountains not, Be'ever HaYarden, past the Jordan? So says this reading, Me'ever liyarden va'elech. Beyond the Jordan doesn't mean right beyond the Jordan. It means going from beyond the Jordan and forward. So at a distance from the Jordan. These are the words of Rabbi Yehuda. So when the verse says, are they not in the passing of the Jordan, Be'ever hayarden, you should understand that to mean way beyond the Jordan. So if we're on the eastern side, so then it's west, you got to pass the Jordan and then walk westward, even farther, beyond the Jordan. Now, if that's the case, when the next description says, after the way of the coming of the sun, that would mean you got to go far beyond, like after the way of the coming of the sun, far beyond the coming of the sun. The coming of the sun is on the east, so then you got to go far west, right? So if Ever Yarden, if other side of the Jordan means way beyond the Jordan, walking westward, and after the way of the coming of the sun means go at a far distance away from the coming of the sun, away from the east, walk far west. So after the way of the coming of the sun means it means walk far beyond the place from which the sun shines or the sun rises. Go far past the east, walk westward. The next two descriptions then is Be'eretz HaKanani, in the land of the Canaanite, Hayosh Barava, which is in Araba, which we could translate as plains, or it could be location called Araba. Therefore, in this translation, which the location is far westward, right? Then we're going to say that it's the land of the Canaanites, in which the Arava settles. Elu HaGrizim VaRevel. This then is the Mount Grizim and Evel, which we know of, Sheyoshvim, in which are settled Kutim, the Kutim. The Kutim today, says Rabbi Yehuda, are settled in the Mount of Evel and Grizim, which is far westward from the Jordan. So he's telling his readers, you know that place? Mount Grizim and Evel, where the Kutim today are? That's the place where once upon a time the Canaanites were. That's westward from the Jordan, and that fits the description. And therefore, when it says Mul HaGilgal, opposite the Gilgal, that is because Samach LaGilgal, it's right near Gilgal. So opposite doesn't mean way beyond, but opposite means like near. Mul HaGilgal means, I shouldn't say the word opposite. Mul means like facing the Gilgal. So facing the Gilgal means just adjacent to the Gilgal.
So it means that the Gilgal is more west than where the location is for this one.
No, that is where it is. It's right nearby, right adjacent to
Right,
Gilgal.
Go west, but don't go beyond that.
Right, so go westward all the way till Gilgal, and right near there you'll find those two mountains. And the Torah describes westward as past the Jordan, which is west of where they are, after the way or at a distance from the way of where the sun comes, which is opposite, far away from where the sun rises. Keep on walking west till you hit to the mountains. That is where the Canaanites live, which today says the Kutim live, and that is adjacent to Gilgal. And the verse says, near the plains of Morah. Where's the plains of Morah? Says Yehuda, that's Shechem. That's right near Shechem, which again is westward from the Jordan, right? Shechem is closer to the West Bank. Right? It's in the territory today. Shechem, so you're walking westward towards that area. Now, how do we know that Elena Morah, the plains of Morah, is Shechem? Because the Halon Hu Omer, elsewhere it says, when Avram is traveling, Vayavar Avram Ba'aretz, Avram traveled through the land, Ad Makom Shechem, to the location of Shechem, Ad Elon Moira, to the plains of Moira. So Malahalan just is over there by Abraham. The plains of Moira, Elon Moira, Ha'amor Lahalan, which is said there is Shechem, is by Shechem, Afkan. So to here, when the Torah describes the location of these mountains at the plains of Moira, it's the same plains of Moira that Abraham went to, which is Shechem. This is Rehuda's view in deciphering this description of where the mountains of Evel and Gerizim are, which means in Rehuda's view, God's telling them, cross the Jordan and walk all the way westward to the other side of Israel, essentially, almost the other side of Israel. And that's near Gilgal, that's near the plains of Morah, which is Shechem. That's where the Canaanites are, and there you'll find the mountains of Gerizim and Evel. Rehuda's view. Before we get to the other view,
They use a Gezerah Shava for that?
Yes, it's Gezerah Shava. This is Gezerah Shava. This Elon Murder is Gezerah Shava.
With Abraham.
That's right. Elon Murder by Avram is Shechem. So Elon Murder here is Shechem. Right? Okay. Yes, it's a Gezerah Shava. So before the Gemara gets to the next opinion in deciphering the same verse, which is the exact opposite of this description, whereas we placed just now, Yehuda placed Eval and Grizim all the way to the west, the next opinion is going to bring it right past the Jordan, so it's west of where they are, but east in terms of it's the eastern, well, it's the western bank of the thing, but it's east in terms of it's closer to them rather than it's as east as you can go close to the Jordan. So it's west, but it's as east as you can go when you're coming from that direction.
It's closer than where there's.
That's right. So as opposed to cross the Jordan, is it right there? That would be the second opinion, which we're going to address soon. Or, as we just said, cross the Jordan and then walk westward till you get there. Okay. So before the Gemara gets to that, the Gemara says as follows. Tanya, we learned, Rashi says to take the word Tanya out because it's still the same Mishnah text. Amr Rabbi Lezer Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Lezer son of Rabbi Yossi says, the Davar Zeh, with regard to this question, Zayafti, I proved invalid Sifrei Kutayim, the books of the Kutim. Now, the books of the Kutim were people who believed in scripture, but rejected the oral tradition. Now, the problem with that is, just on a very basic level, before we get into the belief in the faith of the fact that God gave both the oral and the written tradition, but just the written text itself is impossible to have without anything else. Because the language is so cryptic that it requires interpretive translation. Even if you're to go as translating as, first of all, any translation is an interpretation, always. But if you take a novel, take Shakespeare and translate it into French, so you would lose maybe some syntax, you would lose some inflection, things of that nature. But you could get as direct as possible because the text is pretty straightforward. But if you were to take the Torah and translate it, considering it is an encryptic text, like the verse we're looking at here, how do you translate it literally? How do you translate literally past the path of the coming of the sun? That's not a description, right? So the text itself begs for interpretation. So no matter how you translate the text, you are stuck with interpretation. And therefore, unless you believe there's an oral tradition that provides the possibility for translation, every translation you have is corrupt. You can't avoid it. So Rabbi Yossi is saying, I use this verse, an encryptic verse, to indicate that they are also doing translation that's interpretive, but they're just not admitting it. How's that? So I told them, says Rabbi Yossi, you've corrupted your own Torah by giving it interpretation while claiming that you're not giving any interpretation. Why? And he says, and they had no response to me, because indeed they are interpreting. So he explained, you, Kutim, who reject the oral tradition, you agree, you say that the plains of Moira is describing the location of the two mountains, you agree that it's near Shechem, or it is Shechem. We also agree that the plains of Moira describing where the mountains are is Shechem. But we derive that Gezerah Shava, using the Gezerah Shava. And the Gezerah Shava is not our interpretation. Gezerah Shava, as to our belief, is a tradition from Moshe Rabbeinu. So the same God who gave us a text is the same God who said, take Gezerah Shava and figure out what the text means. Sorry? No, see, we are using that. So when we do interpretation, right, we are using a system that we receive by tradition. But Atem, you guys who are doing the exact same interpretation, but from where did you get that permission, as it were, to give that interpretation beyond the literal text? It doesn't say Shechem. It says plains of Moira. But you guys also concluded it's Shechem. How? And why? Because you guys are stuck that you have to do interpretation. Yeah. But you're going to say, no, we're not interpreting, we're doing the literal. No, you're not. You're also interpreting. So whereas when I interpret, I have a tradition from Moshe Rabbeinu, Gezerah Shava, here's how I can interpret by my faith. But by your faith, you're claiming to have no interpretation, and yet you're coming to the exact same interpretation as us. Right, which is problem that you can find in almost every verse in Torah, right? Torah says, don't do any work on Shabbos. Go to find work. Torah says, don't leave your location on Shabbos. What location? Should I sit in my chair all Shabbos? Stay in my house all Shabbos? Stay in my city all Shabbos? So whichever one you choose, you're stuck with an interpretation.
Don't light a fire in the dark.
That's right. So whichever one you choose, which, by the way, many of the Sadducees chose that when it says don't leave your place, it means don't leave your house. Well, maybe it means don't leave your chair.
You can't go to shul.
Forget shul for the, why
No matter
shul?
what they're interpreting, no matter what.
No matter what you're interpreting. So whereas
Um,
our interpretation is reliant on our faith, if this is a tradition going back to Moshe Rabbeinu, this is how you interpret, good. So in other words, whether you agree with that or not, but the system of our faith is such that the interpretation is valid. But the system of your faith precludes any interpretation. And if whatever you're going to say is a corruption of your belief.
Do they have the 13 principles?
No, that's the oral tradition. The 13 principles are the essence of the oral tradition. So by you claiming no interpretation, you are stuck with interpretation that you are that by your own admission is a corruption of your own faith. And that's what Rabbi Yaakov is Rabbi Yossi is pointing out using this verse, even though in theory it's done in other places. Not in theory, in other places in the Gemara, the same exercise is done with other verses. Okay. So from now, the Gemara gets to the other reading of this text. You have it clear on that?
Yeah.
Which just in general, it's good to note this, that anytime you pick up a Chumash or the translation, inevitably, it's interpretive. And the translator has to choose, am I picking Rashi's translation interpretation? Am I picking Ramban? Am I picking the Ben Ezra? Right? Even say the purple Chumash we used to have, the Arya Kaplan Chumash, which is a really good direct translation. But look at the footnotes. You'll say that I chose this one because it felt better, blah, blah, blah. And if you were to take Ramban, it would be a different translation. Because every translation must be interpretation. It has to be. It can't be any other way. Which is one of the beauties of the new Chumash we have. The new Chumash we have by Kahas, one of the beauties is that they're honest about where translation and where commentary is. So by reading both, you can see, at least get an idea as to what the literal word is and where the interpretation comes in. So sometimes I'll give one reading to the verse and they'll say alternatively, another reading to the exact same verse. If Rashi, say, gives two interpretations, right? So in other words, I have heard the criticism about the Chumash, like, just give me the text, don't stop giving me an interpretation. But the problem is every text and translation is interpretation. The beauty of this Chumash is that it's being honest about that interpretation. I'm not claiming to be direct translation. And therefore, knowing that it's an interpretation and then contrasting the various different interpretations, you can kind of get to what the literal word is. It's one of the beauties of the Chumash we're looking at here. Anyway, morning. Sorry? Tosfos? Elaborate commentary on the Gemara. Tosfos is a conglomerate of commentary.
Rashi's children, right?
Many of them are Rashi's grandchildren.
Yeah.
Rashi had daughters, and then they're his sons. They're his daughter's sons. Many of them. Okay. So now let's get to the other reading of the same verse. Rabbi Lezer says, the verse opens up with, are they not the mountain, right? The verse before just said, when you get to the place and you get to the mount of Gerizim and Abel, place the curses and the blessings on those mountains. And then the next verse says, are they not past the Jordan? So Rabbi Huda interpreted past the Jordan means way past the Jordan, walk west. Rabbi Lezer says no, it's right near the Jordan. Be'ever Yarden means just past the Jordan, not way past the Jordan. Okay. What's his proof? Because the Hayarden, if you're going to say it means way past the Jordan, as Rabbi Huda suggested, Haloik Siv does not read. It reads a little earlier. This was in chapter 30, the verse describing where the mountains are. But earlier in chapter 27, it says, and it will be when you pass the Jordan. And there the verse goes on to say that when you get there, you should build a a monument with the whole writing of the Torah on it. And as Rashi explains for us, the indication of that verse is that it's going to be in that day. And therefore, it can't be too far from the Jordan, because the travel time would be too long. If Torah says when you get to those nodes, 2 chapters earlier, Torah says when you get to those mountains, build a monument on which you're going to write Torah, at those mountains, then it has to be very close by. Because otherwise, it's way too much travel time and then writing time, and then so therefore it can't be way past the Jordan. It's got to be right past the Jordan, not way past the Jordan. Okay.
I didn't understand why can't they?
Because, sorry?
I'm not sure I understand.
Because the Torah says that when you get to, on the very day that God's speaking to them,
On the very day.
on this very day, when you cross the Jordan,
That's the day.
that's right, it would be way too far past the day if they were to go westward, as we would have suggested. So therefore, Rabbi Lezer says it's got to be very close by, which means cross the Jordan and you're right there.
So the Canaanites are up.
They're on the way out because Joshua is about to conquer, right? But this is before the full conquering. It started, but not fully.
Shem is the same as Shomron.
Shem.
Shem, yeah, we built the.
Yes. Yeah. Rashi actually does use the word Shomron. Rashi tells us, quotes to a verse in the Book of Kings, which describes the Shomron. Yeah. So yes, Shomron. The Shomron. Yeah, Rashi does say that. Good one. Okay, so therefore now he has to interpret the rest of the verse. So go just past the river, not way past the river. Okay, so now what is the meaning of Achrei derech mavoy hashemesh? After the way of the coming of the sun. Right? So in the earlier interpretation, after the way of coming of the sun means go way past the place where the coming of the sun is. Coming of the sun being where the sun arrives on the east, so go west. So he's got to say the reverse now. The way of the coming of the sun actually means the coming of the sun back home, as it were, setting. So after the way of the coming of the sun means far from the location where the sun sets. So stay as eastward as possible, right on the riverbank. That's how he translates the same words. Exactly the opposite. After the way of the coming of the sun, first interpretation means go way past where the sun arrives. And after the way of the coming of the sun in the second view means stay far away from where the sun sets, meaning as eastward as you possibly can after you cross the Jordan. That's it. And therefore, Eretz HaKnani, what's the place of the Canaanites? Unlike you, which said it's the place where the Kutim today are in the Shomron by Shechem, it's the location of Eretz Chivi. It's the place of the Chivi. Now, if that's the case, they're stuck with the other interpretations. So we can stop here, right? But there's still more descriptions in the verse. Number one, Hayeshe Barova. It says that it's in the Araba, which we consider plains. Is it not that just past the Jordan is a bunch of mountains and valleys? So why would you call it plains? And you said Mulhal Gilgal opposite the Gilgal. They haven't seen Gilgal. It's way far beyond. So what do you do with the rest of the verse? So Belezer ben Yaakov, Aimer.
So far, everything's up in the air.
Sorry?
So far, everything is up in the air.
No, so Belezer ben Yaakov now explains what the Belezer just said. Here's how he explains the rest of the verse. So in the first interpretation, the entire verse is describing the location of the mountains. Just past the Jordan, way past the Jordan, in the west, near the Gilgal, by Shechem, which is the plains of Morah, the plains of Araba. Now, in this interpretation, where past the Jordan means right past the Jordan, as far east as you can, and therefore far away from the setting of the sun, as far east as you can. And the rest of the verse, which describes the plains of Araba, near the Gilgal, and the plains of Morah, cannot be a description of the location of those two mountains, because that's on the western side. And here we're on the eastern side. So explain to Belezer ben Yaakov, the verse is coming to tell the Jewish people how to travel in this new journey beyond the Jordan, just as God showed them the direction to travel in the first journey till the Jordan. Till the Jordan, the Jewish people knew where to go because they followed the column of fire, right? And the pillar of smoke, that whole business. When as soon as it went up, they knew to travel. When it came down, they knew to stop. Jordan. Till the Jordan, right? When they're walking in the desert. till they got to the Jordan, right? So now the Torah is telling them when you get past the Jordan, there's not going to be any more pillar of fire and smoke to tell you where to go. So let me tell you now how to travel. Namely, when it says b'derech on the way, it says b'derech on the way past or way distant from the coming of the sun in this interpretation. Stay far away from the setting. But it also uses why does it use the word way as opposed to just saying far away? To teach you b'derech lechu, travel on the paths. Don't sneak your way through fields and vineyards. When the verse says hayoshev, that it's settled be'elan murda, in the plains of murda, when it says the word that it's settled, b'yishuv lechu, walk through inhabited places. Don't travel through the deserts. In other words, till now you've been traveling through desert. Don't do that now. Get on the journey. You're in the natural world in Israel. Conquer the land up front, straightforward, without sneaking your way through fields and vineyards and not through the desert. So therefore, go through where it's inhabited on the way. Ba'arava, when it says that it's in the plains, the word arava says Yaakov, this is an indication of ba'arava luchu, travel through the plains, not through mountains and valleys. You don't need to sneak around. So this second interpretation,
There are no plains.
right? So the Torah is not describing where the mountain of Gerizim and Evel are. It already did that by telling you go right past the Jordan, far away from the setting sun. That's it. The rest of the verse, which describes the plains and the settlement, that's all of a description of how you should journey forward after the mountains, of how to journey. That when you journey, go on the normal path. Don't sneak around. You're conquering the land for God. Do so openly, proudly. You don't have to sneak through any fields and vineyards. You don't have to run through any mountains and valleys. Go through the plains on direct paths in inhabited land, and you'll get the land as you're supposed to. So the verse actually should be divided into two. One describing where the Mount of Evel is, and then where the Mount of Gerizim and Evel is, which is right past the Jordan. And the second half telling you, here's how you should journey forward. Whereas the first interpretation was that the entire thing is a description of where Evel and Gerizim is, which is by Shechem, far westward. So this concludes that Mishnaic text, analyzing that verse as the location of the mountain. Tomorrow we're going to get to the actual description of how they moved around vis-a-vis the ark and the various different banners of the Jewish people and how they traveled and so on. That's going to come, God willing, tomorrow.
So who made that decision
Which one?
to go in that direction? To avoid the Canaanites and,
You talk about later.
yeah, who made the decision to?
Presumably it would have been Yeshua. But they didn't like sneak into Israel. They went pretty much head on. They walked right up to Jericho. They didn't like sneak around. They went straight forward. They weren't hiding, right?
No, somebody had to make a decision whether we're going east or whether we're going west. Whether we're going towards
Presumably,
the mountains.
well, first is Moshe Rabbeinu until he passes, and then would have been Yeshua, I presume. Right? But Yeshua is a prophet also, so I assume he had some communication with the divine, right? He meets the angel at one point who tells him where, right?
That we don't know.
Well, yeah, there's a description. The book of Joshua opens up with his travels. Right at the beginning, the book of Joshua describes his travels and how he did so. And how, actually, the very first chapter describes how Yeshua had the same trust of the people and of Hashem, just like Moshe Rabbeinu. It's a beautiful description of the handing of the baton.
Because he just took over. And,
Right, so the verse describes that. The verse describes the handing of the baton to Yeshua, right? Read the first two chapters of Joshua.
So we have no conclusion where these mountains are. We have two different opinions.
Yeah, that would be right. Two different opinions. That's right. Okay, Yin, have a wonderful day.
God bless you.